The first speaker of this session is Fritz Karch. When asked the tough question to name one of his favorite objects, Fritz replied, "It's really very easy. David Mann." Fritz is an editor, a collector, a merchant, a stylist, an aesthete, and for those of us who know us, he's a living encyclopedia of invaluable knowledge, maybe even a living book of wonder, I think. Fritz became an active collector at the age of 11 and has always been an ardent believer in the benefits and pleasures of hunting and gathering. His formal study was in art at the Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia. He's worked for the last 3 decades in New York City in design, publishing, retail, and commercial photography communities as a stylist, editor, and creative director. He helped create and launch the collecting department at the Martha Stewart Living Magazine, hunting, gathering, and collecting as the Editorial Director of Collecting for 15 years. Fritz has also run an antiques business for the last 25 years in Hopewell, New Jersey, where he studies and practices the art and craft of editing, gathering, styling, trading, and selling antiques and an endless assortment of elderly and recycled objects of functional use. And I'll just add that that is in a tomato factory. Somebody else said something about a tomato factory. Oh, it was in your talk. Right, so Fritz's store is in a tomato factory in Pennsylvania. Fritz is always eager for any opportunity to collect, style, and edit anything, anywhere. So please help me welcome Fritz Karch. I'm thrilled for him to be here.
Can you hear me? I am a collector. Usually they divide primitive peoples into either hunters or gatherers. I got both skills. And I love to do both. This is a picture of one of my offices in New York City. Used to be when I worked at Martha Stewart Living. And it shows 3 of my passions: paper, tin, and velvet, or books. Those are all food molds, and that's all Victorian packaging, the boxes up top. And I will start showing you. They wanted me first to talk about what is styling, what is a stylist. When I came to New York after school, I started working in the commercial photography world and was fascinated by styling. And basically, the style world, the commercial photography world, breaks down into either food stylists, fashion stylists, still life stylists, and I found still life styling the most interesting. And because basically inanimate objects don't lie about their size like celebrities or models do. And it was much easier to make a successful environment. This is an early space that I made just to show you. It was actually just a cardboard wall. But you got the illusion of, and there's all different kinds of styling within the still life world. And there's many ways to approach it. I mean, this is the most simple and basic, where you just listen to the object and you put it in a pretty simple environment. I mean, it's really your job to seduce the object and present it as best as possible. This was a project that was published on an iPad, about 12 interesting topics. And it was just as simple as making backgrounds that kind of complemented the subject itself. So you're just showing up. I mean, you really have to decide whether you're beginning in an artificial world or a real world. And so you're often just showing up to a commercial cement bunker, an empty studio. And so that's the artificial world. And so you're creating these little moments. And you wanted to delight and intrigue and talk about the history of the things at the same time. This was about a clever way to talk about gravy boats. And it was just as simple as buying 2 pieces of the right paper. And I've always been fascinated by sort of the unassuming giant world hiding behind something so simple as a rolling pin. Everyone knows what a rolling pin is, but you start thinking about how many different functions, how many different materials. It becomes this enormous universe within one little tool. And so that's a fun and easy way to focus. It's pretty concise. Another way is to try to take something that's kind of frumpy and out of fashion and bring it forward into a more appealing circumstance. Or you might be just entertaining and educating about something that already is quite an established treasure. Like these are called Kugels, and they're very coveted. And it was just a fun way to educate people about all the different colors and shapes that they came in, from the most common to the most exotic. Or Wedgwood. I always learn a lot whenever I'm given a topic or have a curiosity about a subject. I had no idea that Mr. Wedgwood came up with 97 different stoneware color combinations in his career. Or you just take something really simple and think of a clever way to present it in an appealing way, something as simple as bottles and jars. To me, it's also a possibility for a spectrum of just melted minerals. And you can teach people all in one simple way just by the appeal of color about the history and the age of something. And that's what it looked like when you... And it's just from jars and bottles that cost a nickel up to rare and precious things from centuries ago. So this is two good examples of the idea of artificial and real. The one on the left is just in a studio space where it was all just made up from nothing. We just showed up with a lot of boxes. And the one on the right is where we went to a real house and placed a collection in a real space. And are they both successful? So if we've done our job well, you shouldn't necessarily always be able to tell. This first group is, once again, it can be as simple as taking a colorless thing, putting it in a colorless environment, and shooting it in color. These are all laboratory and pharmaceutical useful things from the past. Or taking something as silly as a cutting board and suggesting new ways or uses for it. I've always been appalled by the concept of planned obsolescence that you talked about earlier. I just don't understand why anybody needs to make or buy anything new. The world is so rich, from the trash can to the flea market to anywhere you look. I'm much more comfortable in playing in what's already there and the possibilities of there. You know, a cutting board, it goes on forever. It's like a humble gift and from a scrap of wood. And then the age and patina just makes them more and more magical. Or you can be more inventive. Here we featured a collector's personal passion for all bug-shaped jewelry. I didn't know that the cicada was the good luck charm of France. So cicadas everywhere, who knew? But this was a clever way to highlight somebody's collection, put them into a context that they might be happy in. And that was just in a studio, was just going to the flower market. Or taking something as kitchen whimsical as holiday linens and suggesting that, you know, there's all these interesting designers that worked in all these very commercial venues. Why couldn't it just be stretched as art? Or why can't a handkerchief become a pillow? And here's another example of where you're actually building an entire room. This was somebody's collection of French cafe au lait bowls. And so we put it in an environment of, if this person was bowl mad, they had hundreds. Or suggesting new uses more clearly for things. The simple bandana. The one on the left shows a lot of things you can do with it, possibly. And how great it is. The history of it is fascinating, and talk about that. Or just put it to use. Or work in a theme where people are obsessed with one idea. In this case, it was birds, so we went bird crazy. And all the different ways that has infused itself into interiors. or fish. It's just the most simple thing, and yet there's this enormous history that you can play with. So that's all situations that were created in studio and artificial. And then we'll go to some real, where we take something as simple as the watering can and make it an 8-page treatise. Or the food mold, which I found fascinating. Who knew that the Jell-O mold could be the new Adam's wall? Or something as interesting as map textiles in the commercial world, the variety of that. And if you've got a stained, ruined tablecloth, turn it into a window shade, bleaches out the stains. And you know, to celebrate, in this case, it was a real interesting trail into all the amazing anonymous designers and artists that worked in commercial venues in America in the early 20th century. I mean, these are little masterpieces, and yet they were just tablecloths sold at the 5 and dime store, or scarves. It's like the history of typography. I can't say it right. Map making, or bedspreads. In this case, we went to a real place. It was a snowstorm in the middle of February. We had to shovel our way into the house, but it worked out magically because all the snow made it feel like it was high summer, the reflections. Or molds, again, all copper molds. It was a particular passion of my former mentor, Miss Stewart, putting them in. But they're little sculptural masterpieces, I think, or putting them to work, showing how like one material can be set the tone in an entire world. Or something as humble as the dish towel. We took this, and you know, often in photography it's about the practicality of how do you create a story on a budget. Well, a dish towel is a very simple thing to take on a plane and take to California, and it was really fun. And yet a world that nobody really looked at that much. Or a theme where it's not really about one thing, but it's about the idea of the bee and honey and all the different ways that it... Or to me, this is an extreme example of a real location where there's no way you could ever do this without just going to the North Fork and figuring out how to survive 20-mile-an-hour winds. But it worked out pretty well. And so this is all in the publishing world, but then there's also the commercial world. And I worked for a time in catalogs and retail. And so here's an example of where the focus is a little different. You have to take the object and make it front and center, and it has to be clear about what you're selling and what's for sale, but it doesn't mean it still can't be the most appealing environment. So I helped found and create the Martha by Mail catalog and worked on styling that at the beginning. This is an example of a different kind of focus where you're still styling, but you're really limited to what you're trying to sell, but it doesn't mean you can't sell it in an imaginative way. It's just a cookie cutter, but everyone needs a giant cookie. Or needs a tea party, or needs a Valentine. So this was a very fun project working with it. It was really about manufacturing and trying to figure out who still made things that they'd always made and see if they're still around. It was a really interesting exercise in getting people to do what they always did well and do it again. It was really fun. So just trying to make really durable. Our tenet here was to be evergreen, that if we were going to make something new, it should be something that could last for a very long time and be of the best quality and function. This is a newer project I've been working on. This is a new division of West Elm called Market, and I thought it'd be a good example to show you. This is the process of styling. This was the image at the studio when it was conceived. So here we're selling a wine, basically a wine rack table. So to make you want that table, put you there in that party you want to go to, and that's the end result of what it turned into in its commercial venue. So that's basically being a stylist. And I've always been a history buff, and I've always been fascinated by how history is behind the object. So I wanted to talk to you about two people I really admire. I call it the big ideas, the two Henrys. There's the Pennsylvania Henry and the Massachusetts Henry. And they were both these very interesting men that were very well educated in the 19th century. And they both went to school and were introduced by this new philosophy about arts and crafts, philosophy from England, about a rejection of the industrial age and mass manufacturing and a return to the handmade and the human touch. And they took that idea to heart and really made very personal, wild worlds with that concept they brought away from school. This is Henry Chapman Mercer, who was very instrumental in saving a lot of what happened in culture in southeastern Pennsylvania. He lived in Bucks County. He founded one of the first historical societies in the United States, and he was obsessed with tiles and collecting tiles, and he built it into an empire. This was the house he built for himself. He started with a small, humble farmhouse that's buried in the bottom there. He took a very simple material, cement, that was very cheap, and he started with several farmhands and a couple mules and built this house a room at a time from the inside out. He really only thought about each room as he added it and didn't really care what the effects of the outside were. You can see in the middle there the original farmhouse is buried in the center, and he kept building and building. It's now an historic site. It's open to the public. It's really quite an amazing place. And he also started manufacturing his own tile and reviving tile making and the old methods. So the ceiling in this room is an example of his tile manufacturing, and the lower part is tiles from all over the world and the history of tiles. And the entire house is filled with, these are all ancient Chinese temple roof tiles in a hallway. He was very practical, and he luckily had an aunt who married the richest man in America. And he inherited a lot of money, and he funded religious pilgrimages to the far reaches of the globe with the assumption that they would send him back bits and pieces. And he put them all over the house, but he basically built this house with all recycled parts and junk and cement, and it's really a marvel. It's quite a large house, and in many ways it's very impractical. It's a complete obsession with collecting, but it was actually, he did have interesting comfort needs. It has an elevator. It has amazing central heat, which was not common at that era. This house was built in the early part of the 20th century over a series of years. And I highly recommend going there. It's pretty incredible. And it's just a mix of the history of tile making. He also collected prints, and it's just wonderful labyrinth. I think I have a picture of a ceiling. Yeah. So these are the tiles he made. He was quite successful. There's really very many of them in New York City, here in this neighborhood, in many buildings. And he would sell these whole themed murals as well as single tiles. This was the barn, really the showroom. He held these evenings, and he hosted talks and the early founders of the Historical Society. And as he amassed more and more and more, when they cleared out this room, I think there was something like over 100,000 objects in this one room alone by the time he died. And he built what is now called the Mercer Museum, which is across town, which was the second structure he made after the house. And it's also open to the public. And it was visited in the 1940s by Mr. Wright, Mr. Frank Lloyd Wright, and I think the idea for the Guggenheim was born there because it's a 7-story space with a spiral ramp that is just all single pigeonholes. He was trained as an anthropologist, and he got the idea after trudging around England through the dust, and I mean to Central America and the ancient sites, trying to find one bit of ancient something, that why didn't he just start saving the tools of the culture that was at hand? So he began accumulating anything from the 16th, 17th, and, well, mostly 17th, 18th century artifacts in southwestern Pennsylvania. And each stall is an example of a different craft. So it's basket making, button making, glass blowing, broom making, hat making, anything you could imagine. He saved every tool and artifact. And then the main space is just this insane mass of stagecoaches and whaleboats and fire trucks, and it's all just hanging. He was really, really an amazing collector. And then the Massachusetts Henry, I think, really has been incredibly influential in how people started thinking about recycling and reuse in a more kind of palatable way. His name was Henry David Sleeper. He's the man on the right. He, once again, luckily grew up in good circumstances. He was best friends. The woman in the center was Isabel Gardner, and that was the curator of the Japanese collection on the left. And then two neighbors. He had this amazing little house he inherited in Gloucester, Massachusetts, that he began to add to. And before he died, it was up to 40 rooms, and he just kept adding and adding. And it is also an historic site that's open to the public, and it is a marvel. Mr. DuPont, who started Winnetou Library and Museum, which is one of the largest decorative arts collections in the West, was probably, the idea came from it from Mr. Sleeper in this house. So Mr. DuPont was an invited guest. This is a floor plan of one floor. It's called Beauport. And he was very patriotic. At the turn of the century, a lot of the motivation was more nostalgia and patriotism for gathering rather than just responding to other things. And he really had an artist's eye and started hearing about all these ancient structures that were collapsing and being plowed, and he got the idea. He started buying, anytime there was an early house that was being demolished of interest, he would buy it, and he would move the best parts of it and start assembling it within his summer cottage. This is a marvelous stove of George Washington that glows bright yellow when it's in use from the heat. This is the entrance hall to the house. That's probably part of an old storefront that he recycled. And he was incredibly clever in the art of display and combinations of color. So that is an early Connecticut 18th century door entrance with the fanlight and side things, and he turned it into a double display case for one color of glassware. This is one of the rooms he added early on, which is this festival of purple, red, and orange. It's an 8-sided room, and he collected red toll when he was running the ambulance corps, I think during World War I in France, and that was the idea. And he just had a magical way of putting things together and the combinations of color and old parts. And really the idea for Winnetou and saving important old buildings and reinstalling them came from his efforts here in this house. This is called the Octagon Room. And it's a labyrinth of funny little causeways and hallways and stairwells. That's in another example of him using an interior window. This is called the Mariner's Room. It's all connected to seafaring, all recycled early 18th century building parts. He then, when he did buy something new, as in the bedrooms, he would go shopping for the latest wallpapers, but he never was really satisfied. So in this case, he painted out all the background and got rid of everything he didn't like about the paper and just left what he did like, and then used the color in the paper as a theme to do the entire room. This is his own bedroom. He was obsessed with the idea of a lacquered room, but he couldn't afford that, so he bought an Oriental wallpaper that he liked and just shellacked the thing until it shined. And just made the most inventive spaces. The way he hid bathrooms and staircases is incredible. This is a back staircase here, you know, the inventive use of display. These were old exterior windows from some important building in New England, and he used them as a way to display books. Each one of those window panes originally was filled with a different book, open to a different page. This was his small library. That was the tower you saw in the front that he added on. The inspiration from the beginning of this room really came from these hearse windows that are carved wood drapery from an old hearse that he just loved, and he built the whole room around that bit. And just layers and layers of, this is possibly one of the most famous rooms in the house. It's called the Golden Step Room, after this enormous ship model of an 18th century ship called the Golden Step. And it was the dining room that also functioned as an exterior porch because the windows went straight into the floor and disappeared. So you were just open. But it's just a great example of all recycled old things used in an amazingly sophisticated color palette and just creating whimsical environments. I think on that, the gentleman that's mounted on the wall to the left was an early type of clock that chimed and announced when dinner came. The bell rang. I forget that position on the boat that gentleman was, but it was, he had all these marvelous follies and novel things. Those on either side of that window, that's the back carving sterns from part of a boat. And he was really influential about putting colors. If you think about the Edwardian era and what the average house looked like in that period, this is really quite a marvel. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about collecting and collectors. This is a friend of mine, and you know, there's many ways that people think about collecting. She loves travel and travel books, and it's not necessarily about spending a lot of money. It's about having a lot of imagination, and many of the books are from her family. She inherited them, or she, you know, sits in a very confined space in New York City, and yet she travels the globe. It's amazing. Or people collect by material. This is all shell objects that I think are really quite beautiful and sometimes functional, and it's all just made from abalone shell or horn. I mean, I'm interested in the natural world as much as the unnatural world. I mean, those are all real horn and the effects of time of how they've aged. But then this is called French ivory, which is an early plastic that was invented, I think, here in Brooklyn in the 1880s, and was a replacement for people who couldn't afford real ivory, and was actually more practical. It wasn't endangering anything, and it didn't crack and dry out. People collect just one simple idea, like the knitting needle, something as humble as the knitting needle, but you know, the variety of material, color, size, design, it's endless. Or people collect a skill. I'm fascinated by penmanship and calligraphy. This was an obsession in the 19th century for schoolmasters as a way to make extra money, and they would set up and compete at state fairs and be timed. The one on the left is a true masterpiece because it's 3 different colored inks, and they're often signed with the amount of minutes it took to make the drawing. And they would be rewards of merit. You would win that as a prize if you did best in class. The teacher would give you one, or you could for hire him to make things. They were often on the tops of family records or in school books on the front page of your lesson book. And they're just amazing. Or people collect an era. This is all colonial revival pewter. So it's the idea of ancient vessels, but it's all made in one small period of time, all in America. I've always been fascinated. I highly recommend The Best Free Thing in Paris is Brancusi's studio. Talk about objects in space and the recycling and the imagination of taking something and turning it into something else. I just think it's the most incredible place. And, you know, it's just bits of stone and wood, and yet it is sublime. And it inspired me in a case, this is something I collect myself, which is tin molds. I mean, it's just a baking mold, but it's also a sculpture. This is a story I did because at my charge at Martha, it was always about utility and repurposing and recycling, but with a practical function. And so you could bake in all these, and you could make shapes and sizes and desserts that aren't available in the modern market. Well, now they are, but they're all silicone. And I just think they're beautiful. Or pattern. People will collect by pattern. Here's a small pile of English transferwares of different eras, which I was very curious about the whole process of transfer. It's fascinating. And then we did a story about just English aesthetic movement transfer. It's just wonderful. It's like all within one color way, but is it hand painted? Is it enameled on top? Is it just left plain? And then I was going to talk a little bit about New York City and the restrictions of collecting in a big way. Playing cards there's an entire society. In one branch of it is called 52 plus Joker, and there are people who collect just the jokers from decks. It takes up no room, costs no money, and yet it's a marvelous, marvelous world of the history of shapes and colors in gaming. I love digging into something that seems so uninteresting, like the pot holder. This is something I've become obsessed with. I mean, it's just a pot holder, but it can be made many ways. I personally love things that are handmade and show personal invention. Here we've restricted it to red and white. I love the color red, another way people collect. But I see here that I've got patchwork and crochet and just a few machine woven ones. But then you can dig in and become more and more curious, and you can bring it down to just striped pants. So it goes on forever if you're a collector. Or you can chase just corn on the cob. These were designed for the handles of pots, so you would never pick up a hot handle. But back to color and pattern, bandanas, another thing that takes up no room and yet you can go on forever. There's a famous dealer and collector here in New York that has 3 drawers in her store. One is for colored, one is just red, one is just blue, and there are thousands. It is an amazing history, from the history of the cowboy or the Spanish settlers through to a Wrangler ad from the 70s or a Bruce Springsteen cover. These are just preserve labels from the 30s, but that color drives me crazy. Dice. Silverware and flatware is something I've always been interested in because it's form and function at the same time, and craftsmanship. A lot of really beautiful things were made here in America. This was a story about Victorian, when it was the first time the middle class really had emerged in America and suddenly had all this disposable time and money on their hands and needed to just consume. And so they really began making a tool for every function. And so to the level of absurdity, you can get a tool to carve, present, or serve any possible food group you can imagine. I think there's an aspic sickle in the middle there. There were carving sets for individual pickles. And I just found it, and there on the left you have the invention of the spork, where you got both the fork and the spoon. That was for extracting olives and pickles from the bottoms of long jars. And I became completely immersed in this subject and found it really, really interesting, and began collecting souvenir spoons, which were, nostalgia is another big way that motivates people, I find. And these were this flash phenomenon in the late 19th century when the railway really made it possible for everyone to start going anywhere in America, and you needed to bring back a souvenir. And they made these incredibly inventive spoons that you could have personalized and dated to bring home as a souvenir, from whether you could afford demi-tasse up to a soup spoon. And they're just these little masterpieces of sculpture. in every possible subject matter, depending what. That on the right, that's all California on the right, and on the left, it's more all vegetation and botany. And there's thousands of them, and this craze really only lasted about 20 years. And the quality, because I didn't take pictures of the back, but the backs are as elaborate and sculpted as the fronts. And so in this case, they're all the way, both sides are equally rendered. And yet it's just a glass of spoons when you want to eat cereal. Once again, utility and whimsy. Just cookie cutters, and yet they become these wonderful little sculptures. And then to full whimsy, I collect pit carvings. And in the era before television or the internet, people after dinner would get whittling, and there's entire books on this subject, believe it or not, and it's quite difficult to, they're mostly peach pits, but there's also nectarine and cherry. And on the bottom right, there's 3 monkeys on a turtle's back getting a ride. But I just find it to be the most amazing. One of my partner's favorites is there in the center left is a working toilet with a lid and a rim and the chamber pot to go with it. And this was one lucky day. This is a gentleman from Adelphia, Ohio, who spent his life carving every different type of nut into a basket form. This was in an aquarium, and he devised this amazing display rack, and it is every kind of nut and pod carved. There's over 130 different pit and nut baskets. Had to have it. Speaking of have to have it, here's where there's always the next day. When I got to the chamber pot, the toilet, and the coffee pot, I was able to purchase. I saved the card because if anyone knows who got the cactus or the dog or the wishing well, I was too slow. And just to spark your imagination, this is a friend who collects any kind of desktop tool. This is, I think it's a photogram of his paper clip collection. There are many good books on collecting. There's a man in California named Kit Heinrich that has made this incredible book called Long May She Wave. He is obsessed with the image of the American flag, and it's a very large coffee table book, and you cannot imagine the variety of things that he has collected in the, this is one small sampling of his American patriotic 4th of July ladies pin collection. And I'd leave you with a couple more collectors. This woman on the left did a project where she did a collection a day for a whole year and did a blog, and that we celebrated one particular passion she had, which was for Scandinavian enamelware vessels, mostly by this designer Catherine Holm from the 50s and 60s. Or the gentleman on the right who's a big fan of fashion, he collected all Lily Pulitzer, who was a famous phenomenon in Palm Beach in the early 60s. And this is his collection of Lily Pulitzer jackets and his rare Yingling pants that came out when Nixon went to China and America got the first pandas. Lily Pulitzer made panda pants. And I'll leave you with the idea that when I was young, my father told me, he gave me one good piece of advice, that if you're really clever, you should be able to find a way to make money doing what you really enjoy, because you're going to have to do it for a long time. Making money, he means. And for once I listened, and this is a marvelous designer and collector. Her name's Katie, and she was obsessed with old clothing patterns. And this is just a sampling of part of her collection, but she actually turned it into a business where she began designing clothes and created her own clothing line, and got from passion and pleasure, hopefully, to profit. Thanks. Jonsara asked me to bring one of my collections, so I have with me here part of my pit carving collection. So if anyone would like to see them, they're more than welcome to come up and I will show you.